The Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. I'll read that text in just a moment, but first, let me thank you again for being here and for making it a priority during this busy season to be a part of worship. Second, let me thank Rick for that beautiful rendition of that age-old hymn. I've shared with you before my baptism story, where at the age of 14 I was baptized with other members of my youth group in the cold waters of the Talladega Creek just outside Ohatchee, Alabama. And as we entered the water and made our exit, the congregation on the banks sang the words, "To I am bound for the promised land," an unforgettable moment. Third, let me say thank you to Jamila for the outstanding job on the sermon last Sunday. I had numerous texts. Many of them said, if that's second place, who in the world won first place? And so what an outstanding job. And just a reminder that next Sunday we want to have a grand gathering as we celebrate Ashley and Jamila and their good work among us during their term at McAfee as they prepare for graduation. Now, one other brief word, and I don't want to chase this rabbit too far, but someone came in the door, looked at me and said, "Oh, you've got on green. It must be St. Patrick's Day." There's always a story behind the story. And that is that I had out my blue shirt, a lot like Ben has on, and getting it ready for today. And I looked over, and my wife and I don't try to color coordinate, but I saw she had out her green sweater, and it dawned on me, I've just read an article that it's Earth Day weekend, you should wear green, and so I get out my green to match her Earth Day sweater. Later, when she came in from this class retreat, I said, I put my green shirt out with your Earth Day sweater. What's an Earth Day sweater? She didn't even know it was Earth Day. She just likes green. And that reminds me of a story, and that is that in different times when people ask you what your favorite scripture is, what your favorite song is, what your favorite color is, 9 out of 10 times, I will say my favorite color is green. Here's why. I was in college. I'd written one of my first papers in an English class, and I aspired to do a little writing, but I knew I wasn't very good at it, and when the paper came back, it looked plumb bloody with red ink all over it from all the markings. I made a B+ in that class, but I went on to the second phase of composition, and the professor in the class was named Opal Lovett. She was a matriarchal figure there at the university. When I got my first paper back, I noticed that she had graded in green ink. I'd never had a teacher grade in green ink, and she explained to the class that for years she graded in red, and it seemed to depress her students, but when she started grading in green, green was the color of growth and improvement. Well, I made an A+ in that writing class, partially because the green ink showed me my space for growth. And years later, when I was asked by the University of Kentucky to come and teach adjunct for their world religions class, and then even later on come back and teach on a regular basis for Old and New Testament, I always graded in green ink because I wanted the students in the class to know what my professor had taught me. We all have room for growth, and our mistakes and our errors are an opportunity for us to grow. Well, I hope going through the Gospel of John is an opportunity for us to grow. And in John 14, there's an important text. It records one of Jesus' final conversations with his disciples prior to that famed meeting in the upper room where they shared the Last Supper. Jesus began by saying to them, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me, for in my Father's house are many rooms." Now, you know that in the King James it says mansions. In other translations it says dwelling places. Here it says rooms. Underline that. We'll come back to what that word means in just a few minutes. "For in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going. But Thomas said to him, Lord, the way to the place where you're going, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. This passage, as far as I can tell, is Jesus' first explicit reference to a life hereafter. In the Old Testament, there's the beginning of an evolution where the ancient people of faith believed that somehow they would be present with God, and they only knew to call it the metaphor in Abraham's bosom. But Job comes along, and in the middle of Job's predicament, when the friends are saying, Job, you're hopeless, you're covered in despair, Job said, I believe that God will provide a goel. The word in English is redeemer, and will take me to himself. There's the hint, at least, of a life or a presence after this life is over. Later, Jesus will turn to the thief on the cross and affirm what has been said in John 14. I first heard the story about Wayne Grubbs, now deceased, pastor of the Lakeview Church over just where I-20 was built, halfway between Atlanta and Birmingham. He was up preaching, supposedly, and though many have told the story, he said he asked the congregation, how many of you want to go to heaven? And everybody seemed to raise their hand. But there was one little boy on the front row that didn't raise his hand. And Brother Grubbs, not to be intimidated, looked straight at the young man and said, young man, do you not want to go to heaven? And the boy looked back and said, yes, sir, I want to go to heaven when I die, but I thought you were getting up a trip right now. Well, there's something to be said for that old story. There's some of us who want to get to heaven a little too quickly, and some of us who haven't really tasted of the life of heaven here on earth. This morning, if you're here and if you have a troubled heart, know that you are not alone. Whether you call it a troubled heart or a heavy heart or even a broken heart, you're one of many in our culture, one of many in our community, and dare I say, one of many in our congregation who are experiencing deep concern or excessive anxiety during this season. One of Billy Graham's best-selling books was titled, Hope for a Troubled Heart. While this isn't about the book, I'm interested in the subtitle he chose because all those years ago, back in perhaps the 70s, the subtitle of the book was How You Can Survive and Thrive Through Even the Toughest Times. What helps you to thrive? What helps you to survive the toughest times? What inspires you and comforts you and gives you peace when you have a troubled heart or troubled spirit? Desmond Tutu, the bishop from South Africa, loved to surprise people by saying, we may be surprised when we get to heaven to find out who is there. God has a soft spot for sinners. God's standards are quite low. Another said, it may surprise you when you get to heaven who is there and who is not there. Over 2,000 years after Jesus had this conversation with his disciples, Pew Research recently revealed that 73% of Americans believe in heaven. That's a higher percentage than profess the Christian faith and a higher percentage than those who are affiliated with a local church. Heaven is one of the most hopeful yet confusing topics in the entire Bible because it's not just pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. It's about learning to live as a citizen of heaven with the values of heaven in the here and now. Let's process this text for just a moment. First, there are many reasons that a heart can be troubled. There are many reasons that our spirits can become depressed. There are many reasons that our burdens become excessively heavy. There is not something wrong with you as a person of faith because your spirit is troubled. It's an indication that you are 100% human. The disciples to whom Jesus was speaking directly had major concerns. Some of their concerns were about the Roman Empire. Some of their concerns were about their work and the work they had left behind in order to follow Jesus. Some of their concerns were about their own guilt over their poor performance or their lack of morality in their past. This essentially means, if you stop and think about it, over 2,000 years ago, they were concerned about politics, about economics, and about ethics, the same three things that weigh on individual spirits in the here and now. Today, the day in which we live, a troubled heart or a troubled spirit can be caused by workplace stress, by tension in the home, by concerns about the rise and fall of the market, burdens for our local church, guilt from our past, and uncertainty about the future. The International Psychology Association recently identified the top 10 things that create stress or heaviness in people's life. Here is their listing in order. See how it matches up with your concerns. Health concerns are number 1. Workplace issues are number 2. Feelings of emptiness are number 3. Friendship issues are number 4. Failure or the fear of failure is number 5. Financial crisis is number 6. Career pressure is number 7. Unfair or unjust treatment is number 8. Personal peace is number 9. And mental health issues are number 10. There are many reasons you can have a troubled heart. And for many of us, we experience 2 or more of those during any given season of life. Second, it occurs to me in reading this passage from the gospel that Jesus is preparing a place for his followers and he wants them to know it. As Lewis Sperry Chafer said, heaven is a prepared place for a prepared people. That's correct. But we often get what that place is all about mixed up. How many of you, like me, sang the camp songs, not only pass it on around the campfire at those youth events, but we learned to sing that little gospel jingle, I've got a mansion over the hilltop. We could sing it in 3-part harmony. Later on, a gospel group took that old song and said, I really don't need a mansion, just build me a cabin in the corner of glory land. Well, this isn't about material dwelling places. The word here that's translated, whether King James, NIV, or other translations, is translated mansions, dwellings, home. Is actually in the Greek the word abiding place, a place to belong, and a place where you will never not belong. A place where you're finally home and you will never feel not at home again. A place where you realize you have arrived at your destiny. There are no experts on heaven here among us, and by that I believe that there's no one in this room who has literally been to heaven and back and can share a word of personal testimony. Neither were there those among the disciples. But there is a confession that comes later that Quran read about so beautifully where Paul says, we believe in this mystery of the abiding place, the place we know so little about this side of heaven, that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Now, I love the book by Brother Lawrence, Practicing the Presence, which is probably one of the best devotional books ever written. But tying the two together, this word abiding place means not only we're home, not only we're in an abiding place, it means that we are in the presence of the Lord in such a way that we will never be outside God's presence again. Recently, in sharing at a memorial service for one of my friends, I shared one of the conversations he and I had over lunch years ago. He had lost his dad, his wife had lost her mom and both grandparents, and we were talking about heaven. And he was into this debate about, well, do you go to the grave and then rise when the second coming occurs and the trump? You know the argument. Or it's what Paul said correct. And when you leave this world, you're actually in the presence of the Lord. And I remember the conversation very clearly, and it's not a technical or quantum physics type conversation, other than to understand that on this earth, we live in linear time. It has a beginning and it has an end. We have a past, we have a present, and we have a future. But I said to him, if I understand the teachings of Scripture correctly, when we move to the other side of eternity, we live not in linear time, but eternal time. That's the reason Scripture would say that 1,000 years is a day, and a day as is it's though 1,000 years with the Lord. It's linear time, and in linear time, there's only present. There is no past. There is no future. It's all present. And so Jesus is saying to his disciples who are quite worried about the politics of their day, they're quite worried about his hints at his pending departure, he turns to them and says, by the way, some interpret his words as though you need to trudge along through this life, survive it the best you can because there's glory waiting on the other side. I see it that way at times when life really gets tough. But what Jesus is essentially saying to them, you're worried about the future, I'm worried about the present. I've got the future taken care of. I've gone and provided a place for you, an eternal place, an abiding place. You don't have to worry about that. What you have to be concerned about is living the life of heaven here on earth. Well, like Thomas, this is so confusing. Many have questions. They want evidence. They want substance. The descendants of Peter, the one who thinks he has all the answers, and the descendants of Thomas, the one with all the questions, maybe exist within each of us. We may have some of both Peter and Thomas in our spiritual DNA. But what I can tell you is that a healthy church is a church that welcomes honest questions. This includes questions about life and questions about faith. This includes questions about ethics and questions about grace. It includes questions about forgiveness and about mental health, questions about sexuality and about grief, questions about death and about resurrection, and even questions about heaven. And we'll deal with Thomas more fully in a couple of weeks. But it's important for us to remember if we have questions, we are not alone. For like Thomas, we want to know more, and we want to probe, and we want to explore, and we want to dig deeper, because this is important stuff. Well, Jesus responds to Thomas. There's this overarching question. It's like the elephant in the room. Well, Lord, you're saying we know the way. We don't know the way. And Jesus uses an interesting twist of phrase that if we don't think about it, it will go straight over our head. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Interestingly, before the disciples were ever called Christians, and before the term church was ever commonly employed, the life of Jesus' followers was called the way. They didn't say we're going to the church. They said, I've become a part of the way. Boy, people would look at you like you were a new age believer if you went out, hey, I'm a follower of the way. That's important for multiple reasons. Years ago, I mentioned I taught world religions class. I made a commitment to the students at the beginning of the term. When I teach Islam, when I teach Buddhism, when I teach Zoroastrianism, when I teach Hinduism, I will teach as a professor, not as a Christian minister trying to persuade you. We will present all religions fairly and equally. You make your own judgment. At the end of the term, I asked them, did I succeed? And they said, yes, overwhelmingly. And then I'd ask them to identify the distinct things about religions that stood out to them. One of the things that they mentioned at the end of the term was, in Buddhism, you have the eightfold path. In Hinduism, you have the fivefold path. But Jesus said, I am the path. I am the way. I'm the truth. Now, Jesus was not teaching a class on Hinduism and Buddhism. There are wonderful things we can learn from those philosophical pursuits in life. But in this passage, in the Greek, Jesus is saying to his disciples, I am the road. I am the route. I am the avenue. I am the course. I am the track. I am the path to a meaningful and full life. You want to find life? Follow me. Do the things that I do. Say the things that I say. Love the things that I love. That's the reason it's important for the church to reclaim what it means to be a Christian. It isn't to sign your name on the dotted line at the end of a faith transaction. It's to say, I want to be like Jesus. I want to follow in his footsteps. And I'm committing my life to be a Jesus follower. That's where the term Christian came from. It means little Christ. Someone who follows Jesus so closely, people see Christ living in that individual. Well, if this is true, if Jesus is the way, it doesn't just mean Jesus is the way to heaven when you die. It means Jesus is the way to experience the life of heaven in the here and now. So if this is true, hope for a troubled heart comes in two dimensions. First, we really do have the hope of heaven when we die. We can live life fully and without reservation because we know our eternal future is secure. We go to that place that's described in Revelation 21 and Revelation 25 that's described as a place where there's no more tears, there's no more pain, there's no more sickness, there's no more war, there's no more death. I remember very quickly going to pray with so many individuals right before they left this world. I've been with so many, it's actually piqued my interest. I'll hold their hand, and many times having the final prayer, their hand will go limp because their body has breathed this last. And we believe by faith that when they close their eyes and take their last breath here, they open them on the other side in the presence of God. It isn't a long, perilous journey. It isn't a painful journey. It's what Quran said from the scripture, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But oftentimes when I would go and prepare to have a final prayer, I would say to the person, depending on their age, what do you want me to pray for? Some would say, pray that I go in peace. Others would say, pray that God will give me a little more time. Others would say, pray that when death comes, that it's painless. I'm not scared of death. I'm scared of dying, which is where I fit in. I'm not scared of death. I don't want a prolonged dying process. So imagine, I went to see a school teacher who was beloved all over the coast of Florida. She was a music teacher, of all things. And she'd been battling a disease for a long time, and we knew the end was near. And I went in to see Elizabeth Scott. Amanda could tell you all kinds of stories about Elizabeth. When I went in, she was less than 24 hours from death, and she was as jubilant as she could be. And I took her hand and I said, Elizabeth, it's so good to see you. You look great. You must be getting better. And she said, no, the doctor says I'm much worse. But let me tell you some exciting news. I said, what is it? She said, I'm going to heaven really soon. Now, I'm glad you're excited. We don't want to lose you. I wish you would stay here. But she was so, I said, what excites you? And she said, I've been a student all of my life. I went to college. I did my master's degree. I tried to teach my students to be lifetime students. And every experience I've had in life, from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, I've tried to learn something from it. And now, I'm about to embark on the greatest adventure of all. I'm going to heaven. And I said, okay. And she said, I'm curious, how does God get us there? How are we released from gravitational pull of the earth? How soon will the trip, how long will the trip take? What will it be like your first week in heaven? Will I remember that you were my pastor? She went through this line, and I thought, oh my goodness, she really is a student of this. But she was so secure in her understanding that when this adventure was over, another adventure awaits. What I would say to each and every one of us, whether you're 16 or 96, spend all of your days living and none of your days dying, and death will catch you from behind. But if as you age, you begin spending your days dying, you will die sooner and miss a part of your adventure here on earth. Well, first, Jesus wanted his disciples to know that when you leave this world, you're in God's presence, and the place is prepared. It's not under construction. It's prepared. But second, he wanted them to know that they are free to begin living as citizens of heaven in the here and now. Maybe that's the reason the great scholar N.T. Wright, just here 3 or 4 years ago over at Peachtree Church, he said our culture is so fixated on dying and going to heaven when the whole Scripture is about heaven coming to earth. What did he mean by that? That the Christian life and our discipleship is learning to live as citizens of heaven while we're still here. Live by the principles of a kingdom economy. Live in the hope of that heavenly city. Live with confidence in the God of the ages who died and was buried and raised on the third day. So what's left for us to do? To live life to the fullest. The great theologian Irma Bombeck said, when I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I will not have a single bit of talent left and could say, I used everything you gave me. Don't let the sun go down on an anxious or a heavy heart, but rather use everything God has given you to the very end. Maybe after worship, when you get home this afternoon or tonight or in your devotional time tomorrow morning, you might be so moved as to build an altar in your mind and to take your worries and to take your grief and to take your doubt and to take your troubled spirit and to take your broken heart and to take your guilt from past sins and to lay them all on the altar and leave them there and walk away to live the life grounded and rooted in the resurrection of Jesus Christ that he called an abundant life, a full and meaningful life. The greatest struggle ever known to humankind wasn't a war fought with guns or nuclear weapons, but a war fought for the human heart and the human soul. And now the greatest war is between the ears of what we do with the outcome of that war that Jesus won over the battle for our soul. Like a morning glorious, let us rise to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. If you'd like to have a conversation about your personal faith or your church membership or even an upcoming baptism, we stand ready to talk to you, to encourage you, and to pray with you on life's journey. Let's celebrate our faith by standing to sing these words together.